My husband let his mother move into our home. Now she's trying to replace me as his wife. I have been married to my husband for 11 years. We met in college and built our life together from nothing. I worked double shifts as a waitress while he finished law school, and when he finally passed the bar, I cried because we could finally breathe. We bought our house 4 years ago using my inheritance from my late father as the down payment. That money was everything my dad left me, and I put every cent into our home because I trusted my husband completely. 8 months ago, my mother-in-law called my husband crying, saying she could no longer afford rent. Without asking me, my husband told her she could move in with us. I found out when she showed up at our door with 6 suitcases. She never liked me. From the day I started dating her son, she made comments about how I wasn't good enough, how he could do better. I always kept the peace for my husband's sake. When she moved in, I told myself it would be temporary. I was wrong. The first week, she rearranged my entire kitchen. She threw out my spices because they were too ethnic, and replaced them with her own. When I told her I didn't appreciate that, she said she was just trying to help since I clearly didn't know how to keep a proper home. My husband told me to let it go. The second week, she started cooking all of my husband's meals. She would make dinner before I got home and set the table for 2. When I walked in, she would say, "Oh, I didn't realize you'd be eating here. I only made enough for me and my son." My husband told me to let it go. The third week, she started doing his laundry separately from mine. She would fold his clothes and put them away, but leave mine wet in the washing machine until they smelled. When I confronted her, she said she only had energy to take care of her son. My husband told me to let it go. By the second month, she had taken over. She was answering our door, answering our phone, and telling visitors she was the woman of the house. She referred to me as the girl who also lives here to neighbors. She complained about everything I did. If I vacuumed before noon, I was disrupting her sleep. If I watched TV past 9, I was being disrespectful. If I made plans with my husband, she would suddenly feel sick and need him to stay home. I tried talking to my husband dozens of times. Every conversation ended the same way. He would sigh and tell me his mother is old, his mother is lonely, his mother just needs him right now. He asked why I couldn't just be patient. He asked why I always had to start problems. Last month, I came home early because I had a migraine. I opened my bedroom door and my mother-in-law was lying in my bed, on my side, watching my TV. I asked her what she was doing in my room. She said, "My bedroom doesn't get good light. I'll be using this room during the day now. You're never home anyway." I went straight to my husband and told him. I expected him to finally take my side. He shrugged and said, "She's not hurting anything. Why do you always make everything into a fight?" Something cracked inside me. I asked him whose house this was. He said it was our house. I asked whose money paid for it. He went quiet. I asked whose name was on the deed. His face changed. I told him I wanted his mother out by the end of the month. He said I was being heartless, that I was forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother. I told him this was my house that my father's money paid for. He got angry and said if his mother goes, he goes. I looked at him for a long time. 11 years I gave this man. I walked to the bedroom where his mother was still lying in my bed. I told her she had 30 days to leave. She laughed and yelled for my husband. "Your wife has lost her mind." He came running and stood next to his mother. The two of them, side by side, staring at me like I was the problem. I told them both 30 days. My husband grabbed my arm and said if I do this, our marriage is over. I told him our marriage was already over the moment he let another woman replace me. His mother's smirk vanished. I walked to my closet and started pulling out suitcases. My husband followed, asking what I was doing. I told him I wasn't staying where I'm treated like a stranger. He started panicking, telling me to calm down, that we could talk. His mother appeared in the doorway and said, "Let her go. She was never right for you anyway." I stopped packing. I turned around slowly and looked at my husband, waiting to see what he would do. What he said next made me realize I never knew him at all. He didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at me with his mouth open while his mother waited for him to defend her. The silence stretched out so long I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. His mother's face started turning red and she grabbed his arm. He still didn't speak. I went back to pulling clothes out of my closet and throwing them into the suitcase on the bed. My hands were shaking, but I kept moving because if I stopped, I might fall apart completely. His mother made a disgusted sound and told him he better say something before I actually left. He finally moved and put his hand on my arm to stop me from packing. I jerked away from him and told him I meant what I said about not touching me. He stepped back and his face looked scared for the first time since this whole thing started. His mother was still standing in the doorway watching us like this was some kind of show she was enjoying. I walked right past both of them without looking at either one and went into the guest room at the end of the hall. I shut the door and locked it and stood there for a second, just breathing. Then I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. The real estate lawyer I used to wait on at the restaurant popped up and I hit call before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring and I could hear kids yelling in the background. I told her who I was and asked if she remembered me. She said of course she did and asked what was going on. I explained the whole situation as fast as I could and my voice kept breaking, but I got through it. She went quiet for a minute and then told me to hold on while she went somewhere quieter. When she came back, she said she remembered how I always gave her free refills and extra fries when her cases were going badly. I almost started crying right there. She asked if my name was on the deed and I said yes, along with my husband's. She asked who paid the down payment and I told her it was my inheritance from my dad. She made a thoughtful sound and said that gave me a lot of power in this situation. My inheritance money meant I had a bigger stake in the house than my husband did, even though both our names were on the deed. She said I absolutely had the legal right to decide who lived in my home. I asked if she could make it official, and she said she could send an eviction notice that would hold up in court if it came to that. I thanked her about 5 times and she told me to hang in there. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the guest bed and stared at my phone. I needed to call Maya, but I felt so ashamed that I'd let things get this bad. Maya had asked me months ago if everything was okay because I kept canceling plans. I'd lied and said work was just busy. She was going to be so mad that I didn't tell her the truth. I hid her name in my contacts before I could chicken out. She answered right away asking what was up because I never called anymore. I started talking, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Everything came pouring out about the kitchen and the meals and the laundry and my mother-in-law lying in my bed. Maya kept saying, "Oh my God, and are you serious? And I'm going to kill him." When I got to the part about tonight and the eviction notice, her voice changed completely. She said she was coming over right now and I shouldn't be alone. I tried to tell her it was late, but she said she didn't care, and hung up before I could argue. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then knocking on the guest room door. My husband's voice came through asking if we could please talk about this. I stayed sitting on the bed and told him through the door that we could talk after he told his mother to start packing. He said that wasn't fair and I was being unreasonable. I didn't answer. He knocked again and said my name, but I just stared at the door. Finally, I heard him walk away down the hall. His footsteps were heavy and slow. Maya showed up 45 minutes later, and I heard her boyfriend's deep voice with her when I opened the front door. She pushed past me and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Her boyfriend stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable until Maya waved him inside. She told me this was her boyfriend, and his name was spelled with a C, and he played college football. He nodded at me, and I could see why she brought him. He was huge and took up half the hallway just standing there. Maya asked where my husband and his mother were, and I pointed toward the living room. We could hear my mother-in-law's voice getting louder and louder as she talked on her phone. Maya grabbed my hand and pulled me back into the guest room while her boyfriend stayed in the hall. She shut the door and made me sit down and tell her everything again from the beginning. This time I didn't rush through it. I told her about every single thing that had happened over the past 8 months. Her face kept getting more and more angry, and by the end she was pacing back and forth. She said I should have called her the first week when my mother-in-law threw out my spices. I told her I kept thinking it would get better. She stopped pacing and looked at me and said some things don't get better on their own. We could hear my mother-in-law in the living room talking even louder now. Her voice carried through the whole house as she told whoever was on the phone that I was being completely unreasonable and trying to throw an old woman out on the street. Maya rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. She said under her breath that the woman had some nerve talking like that. I felt exhausted suddenly and lay back on the guest bed. Maya sat down next to me and said I could crash at her place if I wanted to get out of here tonight. I shook my head and told her this was my house and I wasn't leaving it. She smiled and said that was more like it. She told her boyfriend through the door that we were staying here tonight and asked if he could run home and grab her an overnight bag. I heard him say sure, and then the front door opened and closed. Maya kicked off her shoes and lay down on the floor next to the bed. She said she was staying right here with me and my husband could deal with it. I thanked her and she told me to shut up because that's what friends do. We lay there in the dark and I could hear my mother-in-law still talking in the living room. Her voice finally stopped around midnight. Maya was already asleep on the floor with a spare blanket I'd given her. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the past 11 years. I kept trying to figure out when exactly things had changed, or if they'd always been this way, and I just didn't see it. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear something and jerk awake again. Morning came way too early. I could smell coffee brewing and hear pans clanking in the kitchen. Maya sat up and stretched and asked if I was ready to face them. I said no, but I had to anyway. We walked down the hallway together, and I could hear my husband's voice in the kitchen along with his mother's. When we came around the corner, I saw him standing at the stove making eggs while his mother sat at the kitchen table like she owned the place. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. His mother had the newspaper spread out in front of her and was reading it like this was just another normal morning. My husband kept his back to me and focused on the eggs. Maya walked right past both of them and started making coffee for us without asking permission. I walked over to the coffee maker and poured myself a cup while my husband kept his back turned at the stove. The hot liquid burned my throat a little when I took the first sip, but I welcomed the feeling because it gave me something to focus on, besides the 2 people in my kitchen who were pretending I didn't exist. I set my mug down on the counter with a soft click and looked directly at my husband's back. The eviction notice will arrive today. His shoulders went stiff and the spatula in his hand stopped moving. Your mother needs to start looking for a new place. The pan hit the stove so hard I thought it might crack and he spun around with his face already red. Are you really going to destroy our family over this? His voice came out louder than I think he meant it to, and his mother's head snapped up from her newspaper. She looked between us like she was watching a tennis match, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she figured out how to use this moment. The tears started before she even opened her mouth, and I knew what was coming before she said a word. How could you do this to me? Her voice shook and climbed higher with each word. I have nowhere to go. I'm an old woman and my own son is going to throw me out on the streets. She pressed her hands to her face and her shoulders shook with sobs that sounded practiced and fake to my ears. I picked up my coffee mug again and took another slow sip while I watched her performance. My husband moved toward his mother like he was pulled by a string and his hand reached out to touch her shoulder. I stayed exactly where I was and didn't say a single word. The silence seemed to bother her more than anything I could have said, because the crying got louder and more dramatic. She peeked through her fingers at me to see if I was reacting, and when she saw my calm face, the crying stuttered for just a second. Maya's door opened down the hall, and I heard her footsteps coming toward the kitchen. She walked in wearing sweatpants and one of her boyfriend's oversized shirts, and her hair was still messy from sleep. "Good morning, everyone." Her voice was way too cheerful for the scene she'd just walked into, and I saw my mother-in-law's face twist with anger. Maya went straight to the coffee maker and poured herself a cup like she lived here. "I'd be happy to help you start packing today if you want." She said it to my mother-in-law with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We could get boxes from the grocery store and start with your room." The crying stopped like someone had flipped a switch. My mother-in-law's hands dropped from her face and she stared at Maya with a look that could have frozen water solid. My husband looked confused and opened his mouth, but Maya just kept smiling and sipping her coffee. I felt something loosen in my chest, and I had to hide my own smile behind my mug. My husband grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward the hallway. "We need to talk." His voice was quiet but urgent, and I let him lead me to the guest room where Maya had slept. He shut the door and turned to face me with his hands running through his hair, the way they always did when he was stressed. "Please reconsider this." His eyes looked tired, and there were dark circles under them that I hadn't noticed before. "My mother will find a place, but she needs more than 30 days. I crossed my arms and leaned against the door. She's had 8 months to save money and figure out her situation, but she didn't know she would need to. My husband's voice climbed higher, and he started pacing back and forth in the small space. "She thought this was permanent. That's exactly the problem." I kept my voice level and calm even though I wanted to scream. "She moved in here thinking she could take over my life, and you let her." He stopped pacing and looked at me. "That's not fair." I held his gaze and didn't blink. "What's not fair is that I've been a stranger in my own house for 8 months while you chose her comfort over mine every single time." He had no answer for that, and the silence stretched between us until we heard voices getting louder in the kitchen. We walked back out to find Maya still standing by the coffee maker, while my mother-in-law had moved to the phone mounted on the wall. She was dialing with sharp, angry movements and didn't look at either of us. "I'm calling your sister." She said it to my husband while glaring at me. "She needs to know what kind of woman you married." "Go ahead." I sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. The afternoon crawled by with my mother-in-law making phone calls, and my husband hovering around both of us like he didn't know whose side to take. Maya stayed close to me, and every time my mother-in-law tried to start another crying fit, Maya would offer again to help her pack. Around 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang and my husband went to answer it. I heard voices in the hallway, and then he came back holding a large envelope with an official seal on it. His face had gone pale and his hands shook slightly as he looked at the return address. "A courier." His voice came out flat and he held the envelope like it might explode. My mother-in-law snatched it from his hands and tore it open. I watched her eyes scan the paper inside, and her face went from white to bright red in seconds. "You can't do this." She screamed it so loud that I saw Maya flinch. "You can't just throw me out of my home." I stood up slowly and walked over to where she stood clutching the eviction notice. "I absolutely can do this." My voice stayed quiet and steady. "And if you're not out in 30 days, I'll have the sheriff remove you." The paper crumpled in her hands and she looked at my husband. "Are you going to let her do this to your own mother?" My husband's face had gone gray and he looked like he might throw up. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I turned and walked back to my coffee. The next few days blurred together in a strange routine. My mother-in-law tried every trick she'd ever used on her son. She cried at breakfast and raged at dinner. She clutched her chest and said she was having heart problems. She told him she couldn't sleep and couldn't eat and couldn't bear the thought of being alone. I wrote down every single thing she did in a notebook I kept in my nightstand. The date, the time, what she said, what she did, how my husband responded. Maya helped me take pictures of her things still unpacked, and videos of her dramatic episodes when she didn't know we were recording. My husband moved to the couch after the second night. He would lie there staring at the ceiling and I could see him from the hallway when I got up to use the bathroom. Sometimes I heard him on the phone late at night talking in a low voice that I knew meant he was talking to his mother, even though she was just down the hall in her room. When he did talk to me, it was always the same thing. "Can't you give her more time? Don't you remember when we said for better or worse?" What happened to the woman I married who was kind and patient? I stopped responding after the third day because there was nothing left to say. That woman died. I said it one morning when he cornered me by the coffee maker. "She died a little bit every day for 8 months while you chose your mother over her." His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at me like I was a stranger, and maybe I was. Maybe we both were. The neighbors started knocking on the door by the end of the week. I opened the door and stepped back to let them in. The first neighbor was Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down who always waved when I got my mail. The second was Mr. Rodriguez, who lived directly across the street. Both of them looked uncomfortable standing in my entryway while my mother-in-law watched from the living room with her arms crossed. I pulled out my phone and started showing them the photos Maya had helped me take over the past few days. "Here's my kitchen before she moved in." I swiped to the next photo. "Here's what it looks like now." Mrs. Chen's eyes got wide when she saw the difference. I showed them pictures of my bedroom with my mother-in-law's things spread across my dresser and nightstand. I explained how she started using my room during the day without asking. Mr. Rodriguez shifted his weight and looked at the floor. I told them about coming home to find dinner set for 2 people and being told there wasn't enough food for me. I described how my clothes got left in the washing machine until they smelled bad while she only washed my husband's stuff. Both neighbors glanced toward the living room where my mother-in-law sat perfectly still on the couch. Mrs. Chen touched my arm and said she was sorry for believing what she'd been told. Mr. Rodriguez said he should have come to talk to me first before making any judgments. They both left quickly, and I could see them talking to each other on the sidewalk as they walked away. Maya showed up an hour later with a bag from the hardware store. She pulled out a new lock set and a drill and told me we were securing my bedroom right now. We went upstairs and she got to work removing the old doorknob while I held the door steady. My mother-in-law came up the stairs and stood in the hallway watching us with her mouth pressed into a thin line. Maya didn't even look at her as she installed the new lock that could only be opened with a key from the outside. She handed me both keys and told me to keep one with me at all times. My husband came home while we were testing the lock to make sure it worked properly. He stood at the top of the stairs and stared at the new hardware on my bedroom door. His face went pale and he opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. He just turned around and went back downstairs without a word. 7 days passed since I gave my mother-in-law the eviction notice. I walked past her room every morning and every evening and saw the exact same mess of clothes and papers and random junk spread across every surface. Not a single box sat anywhere in her room. Not one piece of furniture had been moved or prepared for transport. Her closet still bulged with hanging clothes, and her dresser drawers still hung open, showing they were completely full. I stood in her doorway on day 7 and watched her sit on her bed reading a magazine like she had all the time in the world. She glanced up at me and smiled in a way that made my stomach turn. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I would back down at the last minute and let her stay, because that's what I'd always done before. I called a moving company the next morning and scheduled them for day 30. The woman on the phone asked me what needed to be moved, and I told her everything in one bedroom, plus any common areas that belonged to my mother-in-law. She asked if the items would be packed, and I said if they weren't packed by the time the movers arrived, then the movers should pack them and send me the bill. I gave her my credit card information and confirmed the date and time. Then I walked to my mother-in-law's room and told her the movers were coming in 3 weeks. I explained that anything not packed would be packed for her and put into storage at her expense. Her face drained of all color and she stood up from her bed so fast the magazine fell to the floor. She started to say something, but I turned and walked away before she could get the words out. My husband came home that evening and went straight to his mother's room. I heard them talking in low voices behind her closed door for almost an hour. When he finally came out, he walked into the kitchen where I was making dinner and asked his mother why she hadn't started looking for apartments. His voice sounded tired and confused, like he genuinely didn't understand what was happening. I kept chopping vegetables and didn't turn around. I heard my mother-in-law come down the stairs and walk into the kitchen behind me. She told my husband she shouldn't have to look for places because this was her home now too. The knife in my hand stopped moving. I set it down carefully on the cutting board and turned around slowly to look at both of them. Something changed in my husband's face right then. His eyes got wider and his mouth opened slightly like he'd just understood something for the first time. He looked at his mother and then at me, and then back at his mother again. I watched the realization spread across his features as he finally saw what had been obvious to everyone else for months. His mother never planned to leave. She'd moved in with the intention of staying forever and pushing me out of my own house. The look on his face told me he was seeing his mother clearly for maybe the first time in his life. My husband asked his mother directly if she'd even tried to find an apartment. His voice came out flat and hard in a way I'd never heard before. My mother-in-law lifted her chin and said she didn't need to find a place because her son wouldn't really let me throw her out. The words hung in the air between all three of us. The entitlement in her voice was so thick I could almost see it. She believed with complete certainty that her son would choose her over me in the end. She'd been counting on it this whole time. My husband sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. His shoulders curved forward and he looked smaller somehow. I watched him sit there for a long moment before I turned back to my vegetables and continued making dinner. This was something he needed to work through on his own. I couldn't do it for him, and I wouldn't try. He had to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to be, and what kind of marriage he wanted to have. I left the kitchen and went upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. That night around 11, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. My husband's voice came through asking if we could talk. I got up from the bed where I'd been reading and unlocked the door. He walked in and sat down on the edge of the bed looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. His hair stuck up in places like he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes had dark circles underneath. He sat there for a minute without saying anything, and I waited. He finally said he didn't realize how bad things had gotten. His voice cracked a little on the words. He told me he kept telling himself his mother just needed time to adjust to living with us. He said he thought she would calm down and start acting normal once she got settled. I sat down next to him but not too close and asked him if he honestly didn't see how she treated me. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer at all. He looked down at his hands and nodded slowly. He told me he saw everything but he didn't want to deal with his mother's reaction if he confronted her. He said it was easier to pretend things weren't as bad as they were. He admitted he chose the path that wouldn't cause him problems, and I paid the price for his cowardice. His voice cracked when he said that last word. I sat there looking at him while he kept his eyes on the floor. Part of me wanted to comfort him, but a bigger part of me was still angry about 8 months of being treated like garbage in my own house. I took a breath and told him I appreciated the honesty, but I needed to see action, not just words. I said his mother still needed to leave and he needed to be the one to make sure she actually did it. He looked up at me then and asked what I meant. I told him I wasn't going to be the bad guy anymore, that he needed to sit her down and tell her to start looking for apartments. He swallowed hard and nodded again. We sat there in silence for a few more minutes before he got up and left the room. The next morning, I woke up and heard voices downstairs. I came down to find my husband sitting at the kitchen table across from his mother. She had her usual coffee and was scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. My husband cleared his throat and told her she needed to start apartment hunting today. His voice shook a little, but he got the words out. My mother-in-law looked up from her phone with this confused expression like she didn't understand what he was saying. She set her phone down and her eyes started getting watery. Here came the crying routine. She told him she didn't understand why everyone was being so cruel to her. She said she thought this was her home now and she didn't know where else she could go. The tears started rolling down her cheeks and she reached across the table to grab his hand. I stood in the doorway watching and waiting to see what he would do. My husband pulled his hand back and told her the crying wasn't going to work this time. His voice was stronger now. He said she had 3 weeks to find a place and that was final. My mother-in-law's face changed completely. The tears stopped like someone had turned off a faucet. Her mouth got tight and her eyes went hard. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She told my husband he was a disappointment and a terrible son for choosing a woman over his own mother. She said she raised him better than this and she couldn't believe he would throw her out on the streets. Her voice got louder with each word. My husband flinched when she called him a disappointment, but he didn't back down. He told her she did this to herself by refusing to respect boundaries. She laughed this harsh, bitter laugh and said boundaries were just an excuse for him to abandon her. I watched him grip the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white, but he stayed in his seat. My mother-in-law played her final card then. She told him if she left, she would never speak to him again. She said he would be dead to her, and she meant it. Her voice went cold and flat when she said those words. I saw my husband's face crumple a little and real pain flashed across his features. He loved his mother despite everything, and the thought of losing her completely was hurting him. But I also saw something else in his expression. Something that looked like resolve starting to build. He sat there for a long moment just breathing while his mother stared him down waiting for him to cave. Finally he spoke. He told her that was her choice to make, but she was leaving in 3 weeks whether she wanted to or not. His voice didn't shake this time. My mother-in-law's face went red and she grabbed her phone off the table. She stormed past me without looking at me and went upstairs. A few seconds later, I heard her bedroom door slam so hard the walls rattled. My husband sat at the table with his head in his hands. I walked over and sat down next to him. He didn't say anything and neither did I. We just sat there while the morning light came through the kitchen window. After a while, he got up and went to take a shower. I heard him on the phone later that day looking up apartment listings and calling places to ask about availability. Over the next week, I watched him actually help his mother look at apartments. He would come home from work and show her listings he found. He drove her to look at places even though she complained the whole time about how small they were, or how far away, or how expensive. I saw him setting boundaries with her for the first time since she moved in. When she tried to guilt trip him, he would take a breath and calmly repeat that she needed to find a place. When she said she was too tired to look at apartments, he told her she needed to make time. She fought him every step of the way, but he wasn't caving anymore. My mother-in-law tried one last manipulation move. She called my husband's relatives and told them I was abusing her and forcing her out of her home. She said I was cruel and heartless and she had nowhere to go. My husband's aunt called him 2 days later. I was in the living room when his phone rang and I heard him answer. His aunt started yelling so loud I could hear her voice through the phone from across the room. She told him he should be ashamed of himself for letting his wife treat his mother this way. My husband let her yell for a minute and then he started explaining the whole situation. He told her about the kitchen being rearranged and the meals being made for 2 and his mother lying in our bed. He told her about 8 months of his mother trying to push me out of my own house. The yelling stopped. His aunt went quiet on the other end of the line. Then his aunt said something that made my husband's eyes go wide. She told him she heard stories about my mother-in-law doing similar things to other family members over the years. She said his mother had moved in with his cousin for a while and did the same thing until the cousin's husband put his foot down. She mentioned another relative who had to get a lawyer involved to get my mother-in-law to leave. My husband looked shocked like this information was completely new to him. He asked his aunt why no one ever told him about this before. His aunt said the family didn't talk about it because his mother would throw a fit and cut people off if they brought it up. She told him his mother had a pattern of moving in with relatives and then trying to take over their homes. My husband thanked his aunt and hung up. He sat on the couch staring at nothing for a long time. With 2 weeks left before the deadline, my mother-in-law finally signed a lease on a small apartment across town. My husband came home and told me she found a place and put down a deposit. She was furious about it and made sure everyone knew she was forced into this horrible situation. She told the neighbors she was being thrown out by her ungrateful son and his terrible wife. She called relatives and cried about how alone she would be in her tiny apartment. She posted things on social media about how family doesn't matter anymore and children abandon their parents. But the lease was signed and the move-in date was set. My husband looked exhausted but also relieved. He told me he never realized how much his mother manipulated him until he started pushing back. I told him I was glad he finally saw it. The week before moving day, I barely slept. My husband kept checking his phone every few minutes and I knew his mother was texting him nonstop trying to change his mind. He would read the messages and then put the phone face down without responding. I saw the stress on his face, but he didn't cave. One night he turned to me and said we needed to talk about getting help for our marriage. He said his mother leaving wasn't going to fix everything that broke between us over the past 8 months. I agreed because I knew he was right. We found a counselor who specialized in family issues and booked our first session for the week after his mother moved out. The counselor's office was in a small building downtown with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to make people feel calm. My husband sat on one side of the couch and I sat on the other with space between us. The counselor asked us to explain why we were there, and my husband started talking first. He told her about his mother moving in and how he didn't ask me first. He told her about all the ways his mother took over our house and how he kept telling me to let it go. The counselor listened without interrupting, and then she asked him why he thought it was okay to prioritize his mother over his wife. My husband went quiet for a long time. He said he grew up believing that taking care of his mother was his most important job as a son. His father left when he was young and his mother raised him alone, and she always told him he was the man of the house now. She made him feel responsible for her happiness and her well-being, and he carried that into adulthood without questioning it. The counselor asked him if he realized that his wife should be his priority now that he was married. He nodded and said he was starting to understand that, but it felt wrong to put his mother second. The counselor explained that healthy boundaries with parents are necessary for a marriage to work. She said his mother was an adult who should be taking care of herself, and he wasn't responsible for managing her emotions or her life. My husband looked like someone had just explained something obvious that he somehow never saw before. In our second session, the counselor asked me what I needed from my husband moving forward. I told her I needed to see consistent change over time, and not just temporary improvement until the crisis passed. I said I needed him to prove he could set boundaries with his mother and keep them even when she cried or guilt-tripped him. I needed him to choose our marriage over his mother's feelings. My husband said he understood and he wanted to rebuild my trust. He said he knew it would take time and he was willing to do the work. The counselor gave us homework about communication and setting expectations, and we left feeling like maybe we had a chance. Moving day arrived on a Saturday morning in early fall. The movers showed up at 8 in the morning with their truck, and my mother-in-law answered the door in her bathrobe like she was greeting unwanted guests. She told them there must be some mistake because she wasn't going anywhere. The head mover looked confused and pulled out his paperwork showing our address and her name. My husband came downstairs and told the movers to start with the guest room where his mother had been staying. She stood in the hallway watching them carry boxes and furniture out of the house, and her face showed complete disbelief like she really thought this day would never come. She kept looking at my husband waiting for him to stop it, but he just directed the movers and avoided her eyes. When they started loading her bed frame onto the truck, she finally seemed to realize this was actually happening. She followed my husband outside to the driveway and I watched from the living room window. She grabbed his arm and started crying and telling him she would be all alone in that tiny apartment. She said she was his mother, and she raised him and sacrificed everything for him, and this is how he repaid her. My husband pulled his arm away gently and hugged her, but when she stopped crying and looked up at him, hopefully he told her firmly that she did this to herself by refusing to respect boundaries. He said she had 8 months to treat me with basic decency, and she chose not to. He said she could have stayed if she had just been kind to his wife, but instead she tried to push me out of my own home. His mother's face changed from sad to angry in seconds. She stepped back from him and said he was weak and controlled by me. She said I had stolen her son from her and turned him against his own mother. My husband started to respond, but I opened the front door and walked outside. I stood next to my husband and looked at my mother-in-law directly. She stared back at me with pure hatred in her eyes and said I had stolen her son from her. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. The movers finished loading the truck and my mother-in-law got into my husband's car so he could follow them to her new apartment. I stayed home and watched them drive away. The house felt different immediately, like I could finally breathe properly. I walked through each room and noticed how empty they felt without her presence filling every corner. That night after my husband came back from helping his mother unpack, we sat in our living room for the first time in 8 months without her there. The tension in the air slowly started to drain away, and I felt my shoulders relax. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. We spent the weekend reclaiming our space together. I put my kitchen back the way I liked it with my spices in the cabinet where they belonged. We moved furniture back to where it was before his mother rearranged everything. We hung up photos she had taken down and put away decorations she had replaced with her own. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. Sunday night, my husband sat me down and apologized more deeply than he had before. He listed specific ways he failed me and acknowledged each time he chose his mother's comfort over my well-being. He promised to do better and said he would prove it through his actions, not just his words. I told him I wanted to believe him, but I needed to see sustained change. We started therapy every week and slowly worked on rebuilding our relationship. My husband learned to set boundaries with his mother when she called crying or showed up unannounced. She learned she couldn't manipulate him anymore by threatening to cut him off or making him feel guilty. My mother-in-law called my husband's phone every single day during the first 2 weeks after she moved out. I could hear it ringing at all hours and watched him decline most of the calls. When he did answer, the conversations were short and he kept his voice low. She would cry and beg him to come visit her or complain about her apartment or ask when she could come back home. My husband told her firmly that she could call once a week on Sundays, and he wouldn't discuss me or our marriage with her anymore. She screamed at him through the phone loud enough that I could hear her from across the room calling him ungrateful and saying I had poisoned his mind against her. He held the phone away from his ear until she finished yelling and then repeated his boundary about once a week before hanging up. The next Sunday when she called, she tried a different approach and acted sweet and concerned about how he was doing. She asked if he was eating properly and sleeping well and taking care of himself without her there to look after him. My husband answered her questions briefly, and when she started asking about me, he cut her off and reminded her that topic was off limits. She got angry again and said she had a right to know what was happening in her son's life. He told her she gave up that right when she refused to respect his wife and his marriage. The phone calls continued every Sunday, but my husband stuck to his boundaries even when she cried or raged or tried to guilt him. I watched him handle each call with growing firmness and felt something shift inside me. 3 months passed and the house felt completely different. I could walk into any room without finding my mother-in-law sitting there or hearing her voice criticizing something I had done. The kitchen was arranged exactly how I wanted it with my spices back in their proper places. My bedroom was mine again, and I could leave my things wherever I wanted without someone moving them or complaining. I started sleeping better because I wasn't constantly tense waiting for the next confrontation or manipulation. I came home from work and felt actual relief instead of dread when I opened the front door. The silence in the house was peaceful instead of hostile, and I could finally relax on my own couch without someone glaring at me or making pointed comments. My husband and I ate dinner together at our own table and talked about our days without his mother inserting herself into every conversation. We watched TV in the evenings without someone telling us it was too loud or the wrong channel. I realized one night while sitting in the living room that I felt comfortable in my own home for the first time in 8 months. The constant weight on my chest had lifted and I could breathe normally again. October came and my mother-in-law called my husband demanding to know what our plans were for Thanksgiving. She announced that she would be coming to our house for the holiday like she always did and wanted to know what time dinner would be served. My husband took a deep breath and told her we were spending Thanksgiving alone this year as a couple. She laughed like he was joking and said of course she was coming for Thanksgiving because that's what families do. He repeated that we needed this time to focus on our marriage and she wasn't invited this year. The line went quiet for several seconds before she started crying and asking how he could exclude his own mother from a family holiday. She said she would be all alone on Thanksgiving with no one to cook for her or spend time with her. My husband stayed calm and suggested she could have dinner with his aunt or join a community meal at her church. She switched from crying to yelling and said I was the one making him do this, and he was choosing me over his own mother on a holiday. He told her he was making his own choices and they were the right choices for his marriage. She hung up on him, but he didn't call her back. When Thanksgiving arrived, we cooked a small meal together and ate at our dining room table with candles lit. It felt like the first real holiday we had shared in years. I started noticing small things my husband did that proved he meant what he said about changing. When his mother called and tried to ask about me or our relationship, he immediately shut down the conversation instead of entertaining her questions. When she sent him text messages complaining about her apartment or her loneliness, he responded with practical suggestions instead of rushing over to fix everything. When she tried to invite herself to our house for various reasons, he said no clearly, and didn't waver when she pushed back. I watched him maintain these boundaries week after week, even when she cried real tears, or sent him long messages about how hurt she was. He stopped making excuses for her behavior, and started acknowledging out loud when she was trying to manipulate him. One Sunday, after a particularly difficult phone call where she had sobbed about being abandoned, my husband sat down next to me and said he finally understood what I had been dealing with all those months. He said watching her try to control him from a distance made him realize how much worse it must have been for me when she lived here. I didn't say anything, but I felt something inside me start to soften toward him. He was finally choosing our marriage over his mother's endless demands and manipulation tactics. Our anniversary fell in early December, and we decided to celebrate quietly at home instead of going out. My husband cooked dinner while I set the table with our nice dishes and lit candles around the living room. We ate slowly and talked about the past year and how close we had come to losing everything. After dinner, he pulled out a small wrapped box and handed it to me with nervous hands. I opened it to find a delicate gold necklace with 2 initials intertwined together. He fastened it around my neck and said he wanted me to have something that represented both of us together as equal partners. He told me he knew he had a long way to go to earn back my complete trust, but he wanted to renew our vows someday when he had proven himself worthy of that. I touched the necklace and felt tears in my eyes for the first time in months that weren't from anger or hurt. We sat together on the couch afterward and he held my hand gently like he was afraid I might pull away. I didn't pull away. My mother-in-law eventually stopped trying to force her way back into our daily lives. The Sunday phone calls continued, but she stopped using them to complain about me or demand special treatment. She accepted that my husband wouldn't discuss our marriage with her, and stopped asking invasive questions. She still wasn't happy about the situation, and made occasional comments about how things used to be, but she had learned that crying and manipulation wouldn't change his mind anymore. My husband told me she had started attending activities at her apartment building, and seemed less focused on controlling his life. She joined a book club and a knitting group and complained less about being lonely. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but over time she stopped fighting the boundaries and started living her own life. My husband maintained his once-a-week phone call schedule and visited her once a month, but he never stayed more than an hour and he never went without telling me first. 6 months after moving day, my husband came home from visiting his mother with a surprised look on his face. He told me she actually seemed to be doing okay living on her own. She had made friends with several other women in her building, and they went to lunch together regularly. She had decorated her apartment with photos and plants and seemed proud of her small space. She was taking a watercolor painting class at the community center, and had shown him several pieces she had completed. My husband said she seemed more independent and engaged with life than she had been in years. I felt relieved hearing this because part of me had worried that she would never adjust, and would make us both miserable forever. Knowing she was building her own life separate from ours made it easier to relax. My husband said she even asked him fewer questions about what we were doing and spent more time talking about her own activities and friends. In late spring, my husband surprised me with plane tickets for a weekend trip to the coast. We hadn't taken a vacation alone together in over 3 years because something always came up, or his mother needed something. We flew out on a Friday morning and spent 3 days walking on the beach and eating at small restaurants and sleeping late in our hotel room. We laughed together about silly things and held hands while watching the sunset and talked about memories from when we first started dating. It felt like meeting each other again after a long separation. We didn't talk about his mother or the past year or all the pain we had been through. We just existed together in the moment and remembered why we had fallen in love in the first place. On the last night of the trip, we sat on our hotel balcony, and my husband thanked me for not giving up on us, even when he had given me every reason to leave. He said the trip felt like a fresh start, and he wanted to keep building on what we were creating together. I realized sometime during that trip that I was genuinely happy again. Not just relieved or less stressed, but actually happy in a way I hadn't been in over a year. Standing up for myself and refusing to accept being treated like a stranger in my own home had saved both my house and my marriage. If I had backed down or compromised or kept trying to make peace, my mother-in-law would still be living with us and I would still be miserable. My husband told me on the plane ride home that he was grateful I had been strong enough to force the change he couldn't make himself. He said he had been so afraid of conflict with his mother that he let her destroy our marriage piece by piece. He said watching me stand firm in my boundaries had shown him what real strength looked like, and he was trying to learn from my example. We sat in our living room a few nights after getting back from our trip and talked about the future for the first time in months. My husband said he wanted to start fresh with better communication and real partnership instead of him making decisions without me. We talked about maybe trying to have a baby in the next year or two if we kept making progress in therapy. We discussed taking another trip in the fall and maybe visiting my family for the holidays this year. He promised he would never let anyone, including his mother, come between us again. He said he understood now that being a good husband meant choosing his wife first and setting boundaries with everyone else. I told him I was willing to keep working on us, but I needed him to maintain the changes he had made and not slip back into old patterns. He agreed and said he knew trust had to be earned back through consistent action over time. We made plans together as equal partners for the first time in our marriage, and it felt right. I invited Maya over for dinner on a Friday night about a month after our trip to the coast. She walked in carrying a bottle of wine and immediately stopped in the entryway looking around. She said the house felt completely different now, like the air itself had changed. I knew what she meant because I felt it too every time I came home. The tension that used to hang over every room was gone, and the space felt light and peaceful in a way it hadn't since before my mother-in-law moved in. Maya hugged me tight in the kitchen and told me she was proud of me for standing my ground when it mattered most. She said a lot of people would have backed down or tried to keep the peace, but I had been willing to lose everything to save what was important. My husband came in from the living room where he had been setting the table, and Maya turned to look at him. He stood there for a second, looking uncomfortable, and then he walked over and thanked her for being there for me when things were at their worst. He said he knew he had let the situation get out of control, and he was sorry for putting me through all of that. Maya studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. She told him she accepted his apology, but he better never let anything like that happen again, because I deserved better than what I had been living with. He agreed and said he understood that now in a way he hadn't before. We sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed easily between the three of us. Maya told funny stories about her new job, and my husband talked about a case he was working on, and I felt myself relaxing into the evening. After Maya left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and looked around at the space that was truly mine again. My husband came up behind me and put his arms around my waist, and I leaned back against him. The journey to get here had been painful, and there were moments when I thought our marriage wouldn't survive, but we had come through it stronger than before. We were making plans together now as real partners instead of him making decisions without me. We talked about maybe trying for a baby next year if we kept making progress in therapy. We discussed taking a longer vacation in the fall and spending the holidays with my family this time. For the first time in almost a year, I felt genuinely excited about our future, instead of just surviving each day. Looking back, I realized that being willing to walk away had been the only thing that could have saved us. If I had kept compromising and accepting less than I deserved, we would have stayed stuck in that terrible pattern forever. Sometimes you have to be ready to lose everything to save what really matters.